you'll be quite punctual studying exactly what
You ready? All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on questions of justice and democracy, bringing climate change to courts. I'm Melanie Jean Murcott, and I'm an associate professor at the Institute of Marine and Environmental Law in the University of Cape Town. And it's really wonderful to be here to moderate this panel today. So what are we here to talk about? Well, in courtrooms around the world, people, particularly those who are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change, along with lawyers and activists, have realized that their perspectives, stories, and voices can counteract the escalating threats of climate change. And climate litigation is offering hope to people who are mobilizing to pursue recognition, accountability, and better livelihoods. For example, in Kenya, people affected by climate change-related floods living on the shores of Lake Baringo have sued government for their failure to anticipate, prevent, or minimize the causes of climate change and mitigate its adverse impacts. In Uganda, young people have alleged that the government failed to mitigate loss and damage from extreme weather events and prevent environmental degradation for present and future generations. In Nepal, a court halted the construction of a road due to its alleged impact on protected species and Nepal's obligation to mitigate climate change. In the Philippines, the government agreed to settle a case and committed to ensuring proper legal responses to guarantee that dangers of climate-related flooding were properly addressed. Now, these and other cases all around the world show the power of various actors to mobilize and confront the causes and impacts of climate change. But what are the implications for democracy of courts making rulings about climate change issues? Not only to advance climate action for vulnerable communities, but also in favor of multinational corporations and states resisting climate action. Well, that really depends on how democracy is understood and what its underlying norms are. Several global surveys suggest that most people in the world want government to take stronger climate action. According to a UN Development Programme study, the number is as high as 80% of populations around the world. So, is democracy government for the people, by the people, as it is where I come from, and an ongoing political process of participatory decision-making? Or are elected officials in institutions the key role players once we've gone to cast our votes on election days? Of course, different countries adopt different models of democracy, and courts' legitimate roles vary accordingly. And this panel is going to explore the complex relationships between climate litigation and democracy with insights from three expert panelists. First, Pieter van Dam is a professor of Dutch history at the University of Amsterdam, who analyzes how people have attempted to change prevailing social and ecological society, particularly around the issues of food and energy. His latest book, Fair Trade, Humanitarianism in the Age of Post-Colonial Globalization, appeared last month with Cambridge University Press. It explores how fair trade activists across the globe have attempted to make global trade more sustainable. Philip Pyment is a professor of law and governance in the Anthropocene at Tilburg Law School, studying the transnational collaborative networks of legal professionals working on climate change, extractives, pollution, biodiversity protection, and land conflicts. He seeks to understand how these networks influence and affect the development of litigation. And Christina Eckers is a professor of European law at the University of Amsterdam. She's the director of the Amsterdam Center for European Law and Governance, and her current research interest is strategic climate litigation's direct and indirect consequences for the democratic process in multi-layered legal landscapes of Europe. And so with those introductions, I want to ask our speakers to each in turn answer the question. So the first question is, how is climate litigation in Europe seeking to address global injustice arising from the causes and the impacts of climate change? And in what ways are courts' responses potentially or actually at odds with democracy within countries? And we'll start with Peter. Big question. And hand over from there to Philip and then Christina. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I'm talking to your back now, but that's Melody. You can also sit in my chair if you prefer. Well, thank you, first of all, for hosting this event and for inviting me. As you might have heard, I don't have a background in law. I'm a historian, so a bit of the odd one out here, but I hope I can be helpful in kind of thinking where we're coming from. And from my perspective, to start addressing your question, activism has played a key role in democracies by addressing issues like climate change outside of the realm of institutional politics first and foremost, and then either taking them into these institutions of democracy or actually also finding other ways to address them. And I think that time and time again has proven to be a really important part of how then democracies function at large. It's just, so to say, a thicker description of what a democracy is about. Now, what I would like to offer in response to your two questions is an attempt to understand litigation within the broader perspective of the repertoire of action of environmental initiatives, so to zoom out a little bit from litigation. And the way I, as a historian, like to do that is by telling a short story. And after I've been able to tell that story, I think I can try to start giving you the answer that you might, my answer to your question. So, about 30 years ago, during the 1990s, environmental organizations like Greenpeace and Milieudefensie in the Netherlands increasingly started to prioritize addressing what was called the greenhouse effect. And they were keen to promote alternative energy, and particularly solar and wind energy, to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And to achieve that, here in the Netherlands, a very remarkable alliance, at least from where we're standing nowadays, came about. In 1998, the Dutch branch of Greenpeace coalesced with Shell, Stork, which was a Siemens daughter, and Rabobank to launch the Solaris campaign to promote the installation of solar panels in the Netherlands. The goal of that Solaris campaign was to persuade consumers, the aim was 20,000 to start with, to install solar panels on their roofs. Greenpeace hoped that this could force a breakthrough in the adoption of solar energy by demonstrating to companies like Shell and the government that there was indeed a consumer demand for affordable renewable energy. And the campaign offered households the opportunity to buy solar panels for about 1,000 guilders apiece, and Greenpeace led this campaign. Shell Solar produced the panels, Siemens installed them, and Rabobank explored ways to make this installation financially as attractive as possible through tax benefits and also through obtaining subsidies. Now, the initial response was really encouraging, as more than 5,000 people immediately registered their interest. By the fall of 1999, about 1,000 of them actually had bought solar panels. And the campaign team, Greenpeace campaign team, paid minute attention to making sure that the panels were affordable. This 1,000 guilder border was really important to them. They really fought over every guilder to get it to 1,000 guilders. That the information that was provided to consumers was really clear, and that the quality of the installation and the services around that were very good, because the team wanted to make sure that other people would hear good stories by those first adopters of solar energy. And of course, Greenpeace would not be Greenpeace if this was not accompanied by a publicity stunt. So, September 2000, they illegally installed solar panels on the roof of a torentje, the Dutch Prime Minister's office in The Hague, calling on the Dutch government and the parliament to do more for renewable energy, and also used that as an opportunity to draw attention to this campaign, consumer campaign, to tell citizens that they actually had the option of ordering solar panels for themselves. Now, this campaign was a very important moment in the introduction of solar panels in the Netherlands, which is a longer history I can't, and I won't get into unless you force me afterwards. And in the Netherlands, which the Netherlands is as unlikely as it sounds for anybody who is familiar with the Amsterdam weather beyond this kind of very beautiful week that we're having nowadays, the Netherlands is by now one of the leading European countries in PV installations. Yet, all was not well. By the early 2000s, the collaboration with Shell turned sour. Greenpeace felt that the company was not sufficiently committed to solar energy, which was confirmed by Shell's decision to first close down a PV plant in Helmond in 2002 and then to sell its solar division in 2006. Now, relations between Shell and environmental organizations became much more contentious after this period. Next to the campaigns aimed at the public image of these companies and at shareholders of the companies to try to get them to do more for climate mitigation, litigation was then used to force energy companies like Shell to take responsibility for the environmental damages they were causing. And this story, in short, is how I think we need to think about how litigation became a prominent part of climate activism since the late 2000s. Just to be clear, litigation is not a new phenomenon, of course, in environmentalism. It is a continuation, I think, in many ways, of the politics of expertise, as we call them, which have been characteristic of the environmental movement since the 1960s, or maybe even earlier. Environmental issues ranging from smoke pollution to pesticide use have been dominated by experts in negotiations over regulation ever since they appeared on the political agenda. But why did litigation become such a pronounced part of the repertoire of action in recent years? It came to the fore, I think this story shows, through two entangled causes. First, since the 1980s, there has been a gradual buildup of declarations and regulations addressing climate change on an international, also on a regional and European level. This is kind of the background story that I think is really important to this development. How these were to be translated to individual obligations of states and of companies is usually not stipulated, of course, as these agreements come into place. And court cases have served a crucial role in articulating such individual obligations. Second, I have highlighted the shift in relations between activists and companies in the course of the 1990s and 2000s. Many companies in that era were seen to either not follow through their very enthusiastic commitments or initial climate pledges, or even dialed back their commitments, as we saw in the case of Shell. And this is something that happens, I think, mostly in the 2000s, and is really important in understanding why litigation becomes so important. And there's a third, quite depressing reason in the background that we should never forget is, of course, that the climate crisis itself exacerbates over the 2000-2010. It becomes something that is not just expected, but is really happening in the 2000s. So I think that is a kind of a third reason, or a background reason, why activists also feel that more active engagement or more follow-through is really urgently needed. Now, if you look at litigation through the lens of this broader repertoire of action of activists, it is not just a way to enforce international agreements, but it serves three aims, and that I want to conclude with for this first contribution. It first of all serves to recenter these discussions on expertise. And I think that's a really interesting, for climate activists, a really important reason to go to use litigation, right? And particularly against the background of both this merchant of doubt history of fossil fuel companies sowing doubt about climate predictions. I think recentering through court cases on what experts say has been a really important part of why litigation was attractive. Second, it was, of course, important to establish specific obligations of companies, national states, against the background of these more general frameworks that were established. And third, and we shouldn't forget about this, I think, is it is also a way to publicize the issue to the larger public of citizens, right? And it's also a way for organizations like Milieudefense to attract attention to their own activities. So it's also a means of mobilization for these companies. And I do think that there is a risk in the combination of these three aims that we can talk about more. But for now, let me conclude by saying that in all of these three ways, climate litigation, in my view, has the potential to contribute to promoting global climate justice.
Thanks. So we're moving now on to Philip, who will share a different perspective. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. Is this, yeah, fantastic. I'll speak seated here. It's great to be with you this afternoon as well. So my opening remarks I would like to invite you to think, when we discuss the potential conflict between democracy and democratic decision-making processes and the use of courts to address the governance of climate change, I posit to you that we often enter into these discussions with the presupposition or the assumption that our legal systems are largely consistent of rules that cohere with one another, that do not conflict with one another, and actions which are consistent with those rules. And only in exceptional moments, actions might be inconsistent with those rules, or rules might be inconsistent with each other. And that's a choice, to view this discussion, to view the subject matter from that prior position, right? From that presupposition, from that assumption. And I would suggest otherwise. I would suggest that I think that many lawyers and movements engaged in climate litigation begin their cases with a sound commitment that there is some law, some principle, some rule that has been violated. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that that's how we should engage in this conversation when we think about it, but that we should begin the conversation from a position of uncertainty, that it isn't clear whether these sets of rules that govern a subject matter, a set of behaviors, a corporate actor, it isn't clear whether those rules are all consistent with each other as they pertain to a specific action, behavior, or inaction. And so when an individual or a civil society organization makes a decision to litigate an issue, a conflict, they are asking a court to fulfill its very basic function in the separation of powers, and that is to provide an authoritative answer to a question about the coherence of legal rules and principles and their consistency with a particular instance of behavior, a fact scenario. This is what courts do. They apply rules to a set of facts. And asking them to do so is not any more controversial than asking a court to adjudicate very basic conflicts. And it only becomes controversial if we're assuming, for some reason, that it is evidently clear that there is no contradiction, that that petitions to courts, the invocation of the courts in litigation, is being done for some superfluous manner, right? Because we all know that there is no contradiction. And that's why I ask that we suspend that point of view, although it seems very often that is our predisposed entry point to such conversations. And if we suspend that point of view, we can begin to think about, well, what roles do courts typically play then in that scenario, in reviewing these kinds of questions? And we start to see that courts routinely play exactly the role that we see them play in climate litigation. They require executive branches to enforce rules that might be politically unfavorable for them to enforce. Because when an executive branch comes into office, when a given executive comes into office, he or she is also bound by the rules that came before them, right? We do not start anew every time there's new elections. They're bound by the laws, the legislative frameworks, the treaties, the human rights frameworks that prior legislatures have brought into effect. And some of those might be very agreeable to their political inclinations, and some of them might be very disagreeable. And litigation is a convenient process, an appropriate process, for demanding a review as to whether an executive's actions are consistent with the law that the executive is bound to apply. Litigation also forces us, and this follows on Peter's remarks, to make a public accounting of a factual record. To say, well, what are the facts that justify an action? And to force parties to put those on a record, and for that to be a closed conversation. We can't, after the end of the litigation, say, oh yes, but we should have also considered points X, Y, and Z. No, we are able to consider the facts that are brought into the process and no more, right? But that offers a convenient public forum to discuss the facts behind governance actions. And I think for this purpose, in this field of climate litigation, we've seen in the past 10 years, 12 years, that certainly in Western Europe, climate change has gone from a subject matter for which there was serious political entities engaged in climate denialism to a subject matter that one cannot hold really a serious political point of view in Western Europe and be committed to climate denialism. Now we see lots of disagreement over the financial and social risks of different degrees of climate change, certainly. But outright climate denialism is a thing of the past, and I would say in large part because of, or in some part, because of the roles that the courts have had in setting an authoritative factual record of what climate change entails. And so from this point of view, I think it helps to begin to contextualize why groups go to court and what role the courts are then asked to play in intervening in climate and environmental governance. And so when last week we saw environmental organizations here in the Netherlands announce that they would be initiating 10 objections to nitrogen oxide permits on a weekly basis from province to province. This is just a very typical example, in my view, of environmental organization asking a court to demand the application of law as it's written, amid a political context in which that is, for the current government, politically undesirable to do so. But that doesn't make it any less lawful for them to have to apply these rules. Right? I end with this for now. A plea to consider that when we approach this subject, to start from the presupposition that we don't know whether these rules are consistent with one another, and we don't know if the actions of individuals, public authorities, and companies are consistent with the duties that they have to act with care in society.
I think I will follow your example and be lazy and stay here. But I don't know, we clapped, I think, for you, so why don't we clap for Philip? Yeah, I want to pick up this conversation at the point that you said it's a closed conversation. And I want to make 4 points. I'm sorry, I can't tell a story as Peter does. That's you came to a talk that is dominated by lawyers, so I will just make my 4 points to you. My first is the closed conversations and the shortcomings of litigation. So we see in the world more than 2,000, way above 2,000 cases that have been identified by universities, research centers as climate litigation. Certainly the number is growing. Some people say that it's not growing quite as fast as it was 10 years ago, but that is a very large number. We have hundreds of cases in European states. So certainly it's a phenomenon to notice and to wonder, how does that affect our democracies? Because it is there. Decisions are given. Some cases are successful, some cases are not successful. But on that basis, I think it is important to wonder what it does to our democracies at a time that our democracies are already somewhat under pressure. And I think no one would doubt that. You can all imagine the different pressures. And the shortcoming of litigation is that it is a closed conversation. It's a conversation closed to a certain jurisdiction, always. A judge considers the law and the coherence of all the norms that you mentioned from the perspective of a particular jurisdiction. So if you bring a case in the Netherlands, It starts with Dutch law. It looks at international law, how that is applicable to the Netherlands and how that is applicable within the Netherlands, but in that order, starting from Dutch law. And it's a conversation that is limited in time. So the hearing is held at a particular moment in time, and that is also the closure of evidence, and that looks at evidence that is produced from the past. So that means that it's backward looking, if you like, at least in its structure, its procedural structure. And then, of course, climate cases demand action for the future, at least at some regularity, not all of them, but some. If it's not damages for the past, it is mitigation for the future, for example, or compensation or contributions to adaptation for the future. But it is limited in time. So we see that, for example, in tremendous past climate cases, if we think of agenda, it was 2020. It concerned 2020. The last instance was given in 2019. We all discuss it still in the university, and it has had a tremendous impact on society, but the actual question to reduce emissions by 25% seems completely outdated. We are discussing 90% for the 2030 target. And that is just the nature of litigation. That has nothing to do with that case in particular. The nature of litigation is that it is quickly outdated. And also it frames, of course, everything we do in terms of rights and obligations. So that is a limitation to the extent that certain interests will not come to the table. Certain interests are just not legally relevant, as the judge will determine. So it's not between the parties. It is not something that can be considered as part of protecting a particular right. It is not part of a particular obligation. Standing. Not everyone has standing, of course. Standing rules, so who can bring a case to court, differ tremendously from country to country. We have a system here that public interest organizations, under certain circumstances, have the possibility to bring cases to courts. That is not the case in all other European states. So you will see, if you look at the climate litigation in Germany, that it's usually brought by individuals, so individual people, because you have more limited standing for public interest organizations. That also means that these cases are framed from the perspective of that individual, even though, if it's strategic litigation, it is usually meant to have a broader impact, to trigger broader changes, not just for that person. So these are the limitations I would like you to consider. And still, these cases are there, and the question is, what do they do to our decision-making? But then they have structural advantages. So litigation has tremendous advantages because it does bring in facts in a very structured way. Whether you agree or disagree that certain things are legally relevant or not, parties are forced to make their case, to advance information in a much more structured and questioning manner than that is usually the case in politics. So when you follow any debate in Parliament, it's also about just the effect you have. I mean, consider how often you read the newspaper and you just wonder whether it's a he said, she said story. Who shouts the loudest and the most provocative is the one that is cited the most in the newspaper. This is not how court proceedings work. In court, you have to demonstrate, prove your point, advance evidence of whatever claim you are making. And in that context, it is also structured around rights. So certain interests we have decided as a community to not protect as a right. And then you can't bring them to court. Whether we agree with that in every instance, but we certainly agree that some interests are more worth protecting than others. So the framing of human rights, with all their limitations, we have considered as important. So we want to protect certain rights. And of course you can levy criticism on the particular choice, but it's a choice that the community made. And I think also one point that is often underestimated, and that comes up maybe in a different context in the case that is at the moment pending before the International Court of Justice in The Hague, is that in court, equality is protected in a different way. Law, also international law, aims to protect the equality of sovereign states. But in a court of law, there are formal rules that try to give everyone the same access, irrespective of how much money they have, irrespective of what status they have in their community. And I'm not saying it's perfect, and I also certainly don't deny that access to court is something that requires resources, and not everyone is able to bring their case to court. And some communities have more difficulties to bring their case to court than others. When you bring a case to court, you at least have the situation that you are equal before the law, irrespective of how much is lobbied or not lobbied. And I think there's a heavy evidence to say that we can't say the same about politics. So while you can say, okay, there's inequality in who gets a case to law and how it's argued and how much you pay your lawyer and how much you can pay for the expert that delivers the evidence, all this is true. But I still think, and I would just say that as a statement that you may agree or disagree with, that you have a higher level of equality in court than you have in politics these days. So it is also always a question of what is the alternative, in my view. So in light of this, I want to consider as my third point the democratic shortcomings of climate litigation and the democratic benefit. And I think this additional, it is not replacing politics, obviously. It's an additional form of entering into the discourse. It's a way of bringing a case, of participating in the debate, in the institutional exchange, not the extra-institutional exchange, on how we should deal with climate change in our societies. And that additional way of weighing in can draw our attention to the rights and interests of people that are not considered by mainstream parties because they're just not necessarily representing the interest. They don't have the strong lobby power, so either in numbers or in terms of political representation. So I think it is important to consider that it's additional and not replacing at any point. I think what is also important in this context is that it brings claims that rights are affected, that I think there's broad agreement that we need to protect certain rights in any event. And what the list of these rights is maybe differs from different perspectives to protect our democracy. So the whole idea that you can make a claim when your rights are infringed in court also protects your civil liberties, protects your opportunity to demonstrate, protects your opportunity to claim that even your property is damaged. So protects the basis on which you are able to actually cast a vote and participate in democracy. So only by protecting these rights, you can have a situation that current minorities, at least as a matter of principle, can become the majorities of the future. Because we protect these minorities from rules that actually marginalize and sideline them. Finally, another point where I think we can say that it weighs into democracy is that it brings broader justice concerns to the front. So we see in all of these cases international laws, but also international political commitments discussed. So when states agree to mitigate climate change on a global scale because it's their obligation, it's their fair share, they say that is what they want to contribute to a true global common action problem, that can be raised in court, while this is very difficult to raise in politics because your constituents are only the constituents of the country that you have elected in. So politicians don't have the same incentive structure to actually consider international commitments because no one outside of the country can actually vote for them if you think on country level. We could think at European level, but the same thing plays. So I think there's structural advantages to have litigation as an additional form of weighing in and bringing rights to the front, focusing on what is important, focusing on rights that protect democracy for the future, but also to bring in interests of those that are not part of the constituency, that do not elect, so therefore their interests are structurally sidelined. And I want to finish on the question, can climate litigation advance climate justice? And if so, for whom? And I think, again, there we must consider the limitations, but also the advantages of litigation. And on the one hand, the standing limits who can bring these cases. And we have seen that it's much more difficult to bring cases if you're not a citizen of the country. We have seen for certain cases that it's principally accepted. If you think of the Julia RWE case in Germany, it was principally accepted that foreigners can claim damages for the percentage that a company contributes to climate change as a matter of principle. But we have also seen the cases that I mentioned agenda before. We can mention cases like Milieudefensie versus Shell in this country. We can also mention now the Greenpeace versus Bonaire case, where the representatives are a group, a fair share of like either Bonaire population or the Dutch population represented via representatives in court, but it is limited to a country or let's say a community, in the sense that others struggle more to bring standing to court. So we have the case of Greenpeace, the Greenpeace Bonaire case, because of the particular historical links of the Netherlands and Bonaire. Not every country could have the same representation in Dutch courts. So there's limitations to this. You can't just get up and say, here, I want to represent Indonesian citizens in Dutch courts. So there's this form of question of justice for whom, but also justice from whom, of course, of access to justice, of who can actually bring a case. It is usually cases supported by NGOs, and they do their best to represent and find litigants that actually are particularly harmed, but also that, whose interest they can reasonably represent. But there's, of course, also those whose cases are for some reason not suitable to be represented in court. So we must not forget that it's not justice for everyone. At the same time, as I said, the international law dimension actually brings communities to the democratic process that are otherwise not represented. Thank you.
All right, so we picked up some really important insights from those three panelists. I think to start with, Christina's last point, for me, highlights that courts, when they deal with climate change issues, are actually always dealing with global justice issues, whether they confront them or not. When a court in the Netherlands decides to allow or prohibit greenhouse gas emissions, that has an impact for everyone in the world, not only for citizens in the Netherlands. And so these issues are always, they're ever present, and when courts deal with them proactively, they can advance justice globally or not. And so the choices about litigation are very important. I think what we learn from a historical perspective is that courts can play a role in legitimizing concerns about climate change, and that they can legitimize or play a storytelling role that brings climate justice issues into the foreground. And then I think from Philip, what we can really learn is that courts are playing a legitimate democratic role, so their proper place in a democracy, by adjudicating contested norms about climate action by the other branches, or inaction by the other branches of the state. And then I think what I took away, Christina, from your talk is that courts also offer a space where politics can play out in relation to climate change issues with built-in safeguards, and importantly, where minorities can be heard. So democracy is not only about majority rule, but about hearing diverse voices. And by protecting rights that underpin our democracies, courts protect democracy. So there's a whole range of different relationships between climate justice, courts, and democracy that we see. So just two very brief follow-up questions, and I'll ask the first one, and perhaps Philip, you could start. So given that democracy is not a one-size-fits-all concept, and some countries embrace participatory models, others embrace more representative models, how does the model of democracy that a country adopts influence the ways in which courts respond to climate change?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And certainly from a starting point, the models of democratic institutions definitely have impacts on the types of litigation, the types of litigants that we see, the frequency of litigation. So federal systems, you'll see increased litigation about divisions between state and federal competencies and the consistency between state rules and federal rules, for instance, that wouldn't be applicable or wouldn't be found in unitary states. Different legal systems organize procedural rules about access to the courts in very different ways. And that includes rules about the distribution of costs, responsibility for costs involved in going to the courts. So if you lose a case, do you need to pay the legal fees of the other side? Are those legal fees the actual legal fees, or a limited or a restrained amount of money, or a fairly exaggerated amount of money? In some legal systems, you'll see if a plaintiff, if someone bringing a lawsuit to court loses and they're responsible for the fees of the other side, well, the other side is going to lawyer up with some of the most expensive lawyers they can find to really exacerbate that financial risk that comes with going to court. And so having those rules in place has dramatic effects on who has access to the courts, in what circumstances, what kind of financial support they need to have in order to access the courts, what kind of risk they're taking in doing so. We also see in administrative law frameworks, for instance, very different historic legal cultures about the importance of either objective conformity of rules versus subjective conformity. So in objective systems, there's much greater standing opportunities, access opportunities for organizations, even if they don't have direct legal interests in an administrative decision. But the principle that administrative decisions ought to objectively conform with legislative frameworks suffices to offer broader standing than in legal systems that are more driven by subjective recourses to the courts. So this is going to have impacts then on the types of narratives and the types of disputes we see pertaining to climate change. With, I would say, roughly in Europe right now, we see a pretty stark distinction between procedural opportunities that allow for large collective action claims based on the kind of, I would say, generic impacts climate change has on the residents of a country. That's what we see in the Urgenda case, in the Klimaatsak in Belgium, the Neubauer case in Germany, with very little differentiation or distinction about how particular subsets of those national populations experience climate change, and certainly no attention for particular individuals. So on the one hand, we have these large collective action claims, and on the other hand, particularly in legal systems where such collective action claims are not possible, we see the far opposite of this, incredibly individualized and specific claims. For instance, in Austria, thank you. In Austria, a case pending before the European Court of Human Rights about an individual who has very specific health effects on extreme hot days. All right, I get the hint.
Thanks. So over to Christina and Peter for a brief follow-up. Yeah.
2 minutes. I just want to say that in continental Europe, we have agreed to certain fundamental rights that we protect. So scholars sometimes distinguish between majoritarian and constitutional democracies. And then we can, of course, distinguish between places where you can review legislative action on the basis of rights and places where you can't do this. But I do think that, at least in scholarly attention to these cases, we give disproportionate room to scholars from the UK writing about parliamentary sovereignty, which is not something we protect on continental Europe. In continental Europe, we have all bills of rights that have an internal bearing, so we don't, I mean, this country is particular. I don't want to go into the legal details, but I want to say there is a large agreement that courts play a role in holding power to certain rights, and I do think the idea that lies behind it of allowing democracy to continue is very important. And I think in climate change we go to that point, that climate change does have so deep impacts that it will ultimately be something that we need to get under control to protect our institutional process.
Yeah, so rather than litigation being a threat to democracy, it's a part of democracy. And playing a useful role in that space. Peter, over to you.
Yeah, I think I want to pick up on that in maybe pointing out more than anything that, of course, that how the public at large views that role of the legislation within democracies is very different in different countries, right? And I think that I think is a crucial element here in what role they can play in a democracy. Because if you are in a country where legal proceedings are usually regarded as norm setting and accepted as such, that is, I think, a completely different kind of vantage point for what climate litigation can do than if you're in a place where where there is a tradition of looking at court cases as political cases as well. So I think there's a really important difference there, not just in terms of what the exact kind of legal foundations of a democracy are, but also in what the political culture at large sees as the role for court cases.
Great. So there's an important difference or distinction to be made around different models of democracy, different political histories, and we shouldn't treat contested and complex concepts as universal, adopting one country's model as applying to everybody. So thank you for those insights. The final, very brief 1-minute intervention that I have for each speaker is, what is one way in which one of the three branches of government, so the legislature, executive, or judiciary, could help reconcile perceived or actual tensions between democracy and justice amidst the climate crisis? And let's start with Christina. Yeah.
I would like to remind the legislature of all the agreements that they have signed and all the commitments they have made, and they should stick to those, including when they take individual decisions that have redistributive effect, including on the communities that need to re-elect them. So I would like to have the legislature do more to actually act coherently within the principles of law that they themselves or their predecessors signed up to.
Thank you. Philip, do you want to go?
Yeah, I would encourage the courts to engage in these cases in an exercise of asking the executive and the legislator to give account to how they articulate the consistency between their actions and legal frameworks. Not because I suspect them as not being consistent necessarily, but because I think it is a healthy political and democratic exercise to engage in that explanation process.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And I think what is a little bit worrying about, of course, the discussion that we're having is that what we're seeing is that court cases become such an attractive venue for activism because obviously other parts of institutional politics don't live up to the same standards in terms of acknowledging what is scientifically established around predictions of climate models, and that in that sense it's a worrying trend. I mean, both in relation to companies and not living up to their wider environmental and social responsibilities, and that, like I told before, like becoming one of the reasons why activists turn to courts. But similarly, I think in terms of what they hope to achieve through court cases that obviously can't be achieved in Parliament right now, right? I mean, that is a worrying trend, and I think we shouldn't, although I think it is a very useful way for activists, for example, to push on this issue, we shouldn't let other parts of the political institutions off the hook in that sense.
Yeah, brilliant. So all three really emphasizing the need for enhanced accountability. I think, thank you. Can we thank our panelists for their insights? And we have a few minutes to take some questions from the floor. And so we'll pass a mic around, and please just introduce yourself if you're comfortable doing that so that we know who we're speaking to. So any questions from the floor? I see there's one there and then one at the back, so we can maybe take those two to begin with.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a dream. We will start tomorrow a factory, a company. We need the space outside to build it. Without permission, there's nothing going on. We need permission for that, to build it. We go to the government, we ask for permission to build a factory. If there's no permission, you're not going to start. So it's crucial. Last week, the same guys who start 10 court cases a week also hold Schiphol accountable for not having permission, natuurvergunning. But at David Inn, they didn't have it for years. For 20 years, there was no natuurvergunning at all for Schiphol. If we start a company tomorrow, we need it, but they don't. And now they finally, after 2 years ago, they're figuring out how to get it. They make something, and the court says it's rubbish. And there's still no, so we can close Schiphol today, if we want. It's not going to happen. How does this kind of behavioral, political, legal, permission, I don't understand. I don't get it. It counts for everyone except for this kind of too big, whatever. And what says this from society?
Thank you. I think we'll let the panelists mull that over while we take another question. It's a big question.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. It was really interesting, and yeah, I mean, I'm Roberto Talenti, anyways. I'm concluding a PhD, mainly focusing on European climate change law and focusing on animal farming as a sector of analysis. So, I really appreciated, as I was saying, the presentation, and in particular, the emphasis on the fact that, indeed, climate change litigation might be an additional instrument, right? The panacea, for sure, for the climate issues. So, starting from there, so thinking about also, indeed, again, about the drawbacks that can come from this expansion of climate litigation, I was actually thinking about two issues. One is the issue of epistemic injustice, which sometimes I feel being really problematic when it comes to both international law and regional legal systems, right? Because even when it comes to climate change law, it seems to me the main institutions still are sovereign states, ownership of, over property. But even when we talk about loss and damage, there is this really clear idea of the interaction between humans and nature, which is really vertical and dominant oriented, let's say. So I'm thinking about how much space there is in court for those actors who do not have this kind of worldviews and whose views are not crystallized, let's say, normalized and justified in international law, how their interests are going to be protected. And of course, so it would be interesting for me to reflect about that. Yeah, and also interesting for me, because here we are focusing a lot, I think, on, let's say, successful climate litigation cases. But what about the non-successful ones and the negative impact that they can have on climate movements? Because that's something that, to be honest, deeply concerns me. A lot if I focus on the US situation with the kind of Supreme Court that they have now in the US. But in general, of course, everywhere in the world, what happens if when the ICJ comes out with the advisory opinion on responsibility of states on climate change, the response is going to be really unsatisfactory. What are we going to say? We're going to be, well, that's democracy, it's fine. They say that states do not own a lot of responsibilities, so they don't. Or we are going to challenge them. Because it's easy to say it's good for democracy when we see our interests reflected in the opinions of courts. But what if courts start being really conservative on that? What do we do then? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. And then I see there's one further question which we can take in this round.
Yes, thank you, folks. Matteo Media, European Studies here at TUVA. Just a sort of provocative question to put things into context, right? So I'm clearly convinced that this sort of the EU is going to save the world against climate change is kind of gone. This kind of momentum, Green Deal, all this is gone. Or is going to another direction, let's say. And this is happening also nationally, right? I mean, the narrative that many political parties have is all about energy security, sovereignty, independence, whatever. And it can go very, very extreme. Certain far-right parties, they even using climate change to make the claim, we have to look after ourselves first, right? This is also a narrative that Vox in Spain, for example, is fostering, right? So I wonder how to litigate climate change in the way that has been done since 10 years would play now when you have this kind of tension now happening at the European level, but also the domestic level, towards other narratives. And whether you think this could be a problem for democracy nationally. I'm just thinking out loud probably, but I would like to hear your sense on these things.
Great. Shall we start, Christina, with a response as you see fit, but just try to keep it brief, and then I think we've got around 1.5 minutes each, really, for each of you.
I start with the last question. Maybe it's very concerning, and I think the point is that I want to emphasize there, and maybe also to the first question to a degree, litigation is part of a broader movement. We need more than litigation. We are talking here about litigation because in this panel we have at least 2 lawyers that are busy with litigation, and I consider it an important part of putting pressure on democratic institutions, despite the fact that I agree with you that, of course, the rolling back of the Green Deal, the situation that in national context we're rolling back on environmental protection, and we see generally a tendency to elect parties, both to the European Parliament but also national parliaments, that are less concerned about climate, or we have elections where climate plays hardly a role. Let's see how that's going to be in October, how prominent we're going to discuss climate, but in the relatively recent still German elections, I was always looking for climate as an issue. And I find that highly problematic, but the only way we can push back on that is on several fronts. So we cannot look at litigation to solve this for us. And I think it's, of course, outrageous that certain enormous economic players are able to basically work the system without complying with the system. I think we have many examples of that, but in my view, litigation is one way, imperfect and can't solve it entirely, to push in the right direction. Consider what other ways you see to push in the same direction. I don't think we should all lean back and think climate litigation is going to solve it for us. And no one, I think, takes that perspective. I think I'm not so concerned about unsuccessful climate cases. I think many unsuccessful climate cases come out with precedents that are helpful and that will push generally the law in the right direction. Not every one of them, but many of them. So I'm not concerned about UIA versus RWE not granting compensation. That is a stepping stone for new cases, and the principle was confirmed that foreigners can claim compensation. And we have seen in many legal contexts that you need several cases to get to a positive, tangible outcome, in fact.
Thank you. Philip?
Yeah, I on the risk of negative outcomes, I guess I'm not so concerned with this either. And I think if there's any country that's had a lot of negative outcomes, it's my original home country, the United States. And do I think that the failure of Juliana et al. Versus the US set back climate leadership and climate policy in the US? Not in the slightest bit. I mean, it was devastating during the proceedings, and it's been just as devastating afterwards, with a very brief period of time in which it looked like there might be a little bit of hope of climate action in the United States. That said, the work of Sierra Club in decommissioning hundreds of coal-fired power plants through litigation and legal mobilization and local political organization has been enormously helpful to the energy policies in the country from the ground up. So I think we should not get concerned with these big cases that end up as losses, because at the end of the day, they still contribute to this process of a public, authoritative reason-giving. And if the worst-case scenario is that process leads national governments who are furious with the courts' answers, Switzerland was furious with the outcome of the European Court of Human Rights decision in Klimasenioren. And if the worst outcome is that Switzerland leaves the European Convention or leaves the Paris Agreement, I think that's clarifying. That's clarifying for the political parties and the ideologies that have come to that outcome to say, you know, the cost of engaging in mitigation is not worth it. We will sacrifice these rights, these very fundamental protections of your right to bodily integrity, the rights to your children to have sustainable livelihoods. We will sacrifice those because it impacts our pensions today too much. It impacts our material well-being too much. Good, let's clarify that, because right now the political discourse is such that we maintain too many inconsistencies, too many half-truths, and litigation forces those half-truths to become unspun.
Thanks. Hey, last word to Peter.
Yeah, and I think both points you made are really important. I think the clarification part, definitely, right? I mean, we need these court cases to clarify and also to show that we are trying to reconcile. And I think Schiphol is a really interesting example. There was a great piece about Schiphol in NRC showing us that since the early 1990s, the latest, we knew that actually the two things that we wanted to achieve, like both Schiphol not being more of an environmental and a social problem and Schiphol continuing to grow, were not reconcilable, but we simply modeled on. Because nobody wanted to say out loud that we can't do these two things at the same time. And in that sense, it's clarifying. I mean, the kind of cold water on that idea is that actually the clarification can also be quite negative in the sense that that the outcome is, well, we actually don't care about climate change or the environment or social effects enough to be able to stop it. But that then might be the stepping stone towards the second half of saying, well, then the legal system can't give us what we want if we want climate justice, and we need other forms of activism to do that. And I think that would also be my answer to the epistemic justice question. I think what the history of epistemic injustices in the legal system shows us is that you don't achieve that through the legal system, you achieve it by changing the legal system. And that's really where also the limitations, of course, of the law, but where we first need to clarify and need these legal cases to see what those limitations are, and then to be able to see what other ways we need to kind of explore to change that system if it's not giving us what we want.
Great. So what the panelists really telling us is to be engaged in this climate justice space, we need to have both an extreme amount of realism and extreme amount of hope. And as the world is burning, we all have to be firefighters. And so the other thing I think is very powerful about this discourse is how nuanced it was. So a resistance of binaries and crude thinking that doesn't take us further along, but at the same time grappling with very complex and difficult issues. And so again, I want to thank them for the time, and thank you for being a wonderful audience. So there should be drinks just on the right-hand side over there. Yeah.
Climate. You know what they are? The Ingo economy, whenever they use in the machines fell apart or whatever. So I was going to my attic and so I found these.
Maar het geeft slecht blok. Deval. Ik zie nu een commissie voor het samenkomen met drie argumenten, waardoor zij zeggen als reactie, pap, nu zijn we bepalen. Ze zoeken de contacten op van mensen die dat wat kunnen doen en aan de knoppen zitten, maar die reageren dus niet. Willen we het in een certificaat, schilderkaart, boer, stikstofkaart, het is allemaal kaart waarin je de kaart ziet en rode draad. We hebben een commissie in de samenleving, die komt de praktijk. Ja, die willen het net niet voor. We zijn al heel lang aan het vastlopen, nu heel veel van deze. Dat we eigenlijk gewoon in achterliggende problemen echt willen realiseren. Al lang over de CNC zijn van wat er zowel in Nederland als op deze plek dat is ook een gebied waar ik het minst optimistisch ben. Ook waar we deze vraag gaat het. Uiteindelijk gaat het nog niet die vraag aankomen. Ik zie nog niet een sterke acceptatie van de het is een minder. Het is zelfs een economie-achtergrond. Ik las gisteren de CBS die houdt die uitscholdijk. De commissie die alleen maar die als die zeggen het is weer afgelopen dag gestegen. Ja, maar kijk hier in Amsterdam die houden die grondstoffengebruik bij. Het is een direct relatie economische groei, grondstoffengebruik en energiegebruik. Ja, als we deze die groeiproductie zo heilig vinden, dan denk ik nu weer met zijn nieuwe politieke programma radicaal voor. Ja, maar dan probeer
dat je bent uiteindelijk gebonden aan wat een meerderheid van de gaat stemmen. Dus dat die zeggen, we vinden het belangrijker dat wij hier achter de rijken de komende 30 jaar nog kunnen uitzingen op een hoog welvaartsniveau en economie. Heb je niet zo heel veel binnen dit systeem in de hand. Je bent afhankelijk van de beleidsmakers. Aan de ene kant beleidsmakers die veel verstandiger beleid willen maken dan en voor een andere deel ook kiezers op net is het vaak veel en die weten nog wat al die misgaat. Die rechtszaak in de basis. Ik zeg op die bedoeld is. Liever niet. Maar ja, als je witness hebt, die is nu heel vaak nodig en dat zegt heel veel. Ja, ook wel over dat we nu op het punt komen waar het gewoon niet meer kan. Dat is misschien goed nieuws, maar in de uitkomst van de die niet doen. Het is een hele goede podcast. Echt een podcast. Podcast is een opgegeven zaak. Maar toen dat ze te lezen, het had nooit mogen bestaan. Maar kunnen we dat maar voor mij dus, kijk,